This is the PowerPoint presentation for Hollywood's Indians, Chapter 5, 6, and 7. And while I'm going to hold you individually responsible for sort of the details of the readings of the chapters, today I'm going to talk about three key concepts that were themes that followed through all three of the readings. And those themes are history, detribalization, and the notion of the other. The first key concept that I'd like to talk about from this week's reading is the notion of history. And the first aspect of that is history versus mythology. And in the book, they had a quote from one of the characters in a John Ford movie that said, "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." And so part of the question going on here is when John Ford was making these movies, did he think that he was making a movie about the fact or about the legend? We'll get to that in a second, but I guess the question, first of all, is what's the difference between history and mythology? And I'd say for our purposes, it's a question of, well, there are events, and there are real human beings who took part in those events, and that's history. And then on the other hand, there are stories and characters in stories, and there are interpretations of those stories, and that starts to be legend. And so the problem is when we use legend or myth to stand in for history. Then, in the case of Native Americans, we're not talking about what happened anymore, but what we wish happened and what we wish it meant. The distinction between history and myth or legend becomes more important the less we know about real history. The reason for this is what a guy named Walter Lippmann talked about. He was a big thinker in the first half of the 20th century. And he talked about how as individuals, we all have a pretty limited range of personal experience, things that we know firsthand because we've seen them. For the rest of knowledge about the world, we just have pictures inside our heads. And those pictures come from other people's stories or from the media. And so when it comes to subjects like the history of the Indian Wars or even the war in Afghanistan, most of us have to depend on the media to inform us. If the information we get is fundamentally inaccurate, then we get what the reading calls cultural confusion. So an example to sort of bring this down to real life is that if somebody made a movie about contemporary life in your hometown, you'd be able pretty easily to see what's real and what's fiction. But on the other hand, if somebody makes a movie about life in a small town in another country on the other side of the world, it's a lot harder for you to figure out what's fact and what's fiction. And so the trust that you give that producer to tell you whether it's fact or fiction becomes even more important. So there are two discussions of history in the reading that are going on simultaneously. The first one is about the film representation of the Hollywood Indian depictions of history. And the second one is the Hollywood Indian films as historical documents. So let's break that down a little bit. So in terms of the Hollywood Indian depiction of history, first of all, the authors contend that the Hollywood Indian version of history was fundamentally inaccurate. Ford and others may or may not have considered themselves to be representing a true version of history, but what's important is that uninformed viewers, like, say, my mother growing up in Detroit in the 1930s and 40s, they had nothing else to go on but the Hollywood Indian version of history. So what makes this even more problematic is that Ford encouraged his viewers to interpret films as accurate representations of history, both by stating that the events were true and by using historical character names like Geronimo. So the next consideration is of Hollywood Indian films as historical documents. And so there the argument is that Hollywood Indian films might not teach us much about the historical period in which they take place, but they do teach us or give us something to think about in terms of the historical period in which they were made. They often use the Hollywood Indian as a way of talking about other social issues, the Red Scare, the Civil Rights Movement, or the war in Vietnam. And in Ford's movies, which span several decades, you can see a real progression in his representation, even though it remained racist. The next concept I'd like to talk about is detribalization. Um, it's mentioned in the Hollywood Indian reading, and I guess the first question we ask is, what is detribalization? There's a nice definition when at one point one of the authors says, Hollywood films usually lump all the Native Americans together, erasing the important cultural differences among tribes and making it seem like all the tribes were Plains Indians. So the next question is, well, what does it matter? What does it matter if all the North American Indians were all lumped together as one group? Well, it's another historical inaccuracy, and it makes for more cultural confusion. It can make it look as if the Indian Wars of the Western movies were the sum total of the interaction between Euro Americans and Indians, whereas in fact, that contact and that aggression began with Columbus. Euro Americans colonized the East first, and there were Indians there too. By the time Euro Americans got to the West, many tribes had already been struggling against the Spaniards and the Mexicans for decades or longer. Many were already displaced from their land, and many were already suffering from decades of war and disease. So, if you decontextualize all of that, it makes it look as if the Indian Wars in the West were a struggle between equals, which they weren't, and that each side was equally at fault, which is highly debatable to say the least. Now, if you connect this idea of detribalization to Singh's readings from last week about Sikh Americans, you can see that some of the same thing going on. People who belong to different cultural groups and practice different religions, that is, Muslim Arabs and South Asian Sikhs, are lumped together as if they're all the same. That's in media reports and in sort of the general understanding of their cultures. So, unfortunately, that means they're vulnerable to the same discrimination and violence. So, the last term I'd like to talk about is the other, with a capital O. This is a term used a lot in our readings. Basically, it means the one or the group who's not the dominant group. So, if the dominant group in our culture is the white heterosexual male, then anyone else is the other. Usually, the other is somehow represented as being less than the dominant one, or more dangerous, or lacking certain qualities that are valued in the dominant group. So, an example from the reading of the other would be last week we talked about Sikhs and Muslims who are not Christians, so they're represented as being less American. And when a tiny minority commit violent crimes, the whole religion is represented as being behind the violence. On the other hand, when a white Christian man bombed the Oklahoma City federal building, he was not dubbed a Christian terrorist. And so you see there's a double standard going on there, where the dangerous or aberrant behavior of a minority of the other group is treated as being representative as the other group, whereas that's not true for the dominant group. Sometimes the other can be used as a substitute for another other. And so an example of this is in the readings when we learned about Tell Them Willie Boy Was Here, and how really the producer wasn't really interested in making a statement about Native Americans so much as he was interested in making a statement about the Vietnam War. And so he was substituting one other group in order to make a statement about another other group. They gave examples of this from John Ford's work as well when he did similar things to talk about the civil rights era